The goal of my paper is to alert you about the existence of the expression. You may have heard this expression, neoliberalism, that has been a buzzword on the left for the past 30 years. Left-leaning scholars and reporters widely use this expression, except economists. Economists did rarely use this word neoliberalism before 1980s for the description of economy that emerged in Western Germany after 1945. Occasionally it was used to describe the third Keynesian way, but so rarely that it was dropped after 1980s. But on the other hand, those folks who represent humanities and other social sciences, they started to increasingly use this expression. So the goal of this presentation is to briefly alert you about what it means and to unpack this expression as much as possible. Political scientists Taylor Bowes and Jordan Guns Morse, who reviewed 184 academic essays dealing with so-called neoliberalism, found out that scholars and writers who mentioned this expression, they totally opposed to the free market. People who indiscriminately use this word, they in fact go further recently for the past 10 years. They use this expression not only to denounce a free market, but to ascribe all kinds of economic, social, political evils to so-called neoliberalism. Occasionally, this expression even used to denounce economic reasoning. Okay. The most curious example of this approach I met in a book of Tom Hartman, a leftist writer, who in his book, Crisis of Western Culture, cites US invasion of Iraq as an example of aggressive neoliberalism that used invasion as an opportunity to impose Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek ideas on this third world country. The story, left story about the origin of neoliberalism goes as follows. In 1938, a group of right-wing intellectuals headed by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek got together and launched a movement to destroy social state and to impose free market. That's a very important phrase, to impose free market. That was the birth of so-called neoliberalism. In 1947, joined by Milton Friedman and a few others, they set up a right-wing international, Mont Pelerin Society. At first, they were a marginal group, and nobody wanted to listen to them. So far, so good. That reflects the reality. Yet, gradually, this cabal, quote unquote, that's occasionally they use this word, cabal, spread the tentacles in the corporate world, financial institutions, and in economics profession. Their manifesto, quote unquote, The Road to Serfdom, by Hayek, was widely read, and as one of the leftist authors stressed, the book, I quote, came to the attention of some very wealthy people who saw in this philosophy an opportunity to free themselves from regulation and tax, unquote. Finally, during the last 3 decades of the past century, these right-wing intellectuals were able somehow to sway entire society, including politicians and the corporate world, in favor of free market. And they became the masters of the universe. In fact, this expression, the masters of the universe, I picked up from a title of a left-leaning author who wrote this history of so-called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism studies argue that as a result of these machinations of right-wing intellectuals and their financiers, we have to exist today in the iron grips of this sinister market ideology. Since neoliberalism controls everything, according to them, in our society, so it's responsible for all kinds of evils. For example, George Monbiot, who writes for left-wing newspaper Guardian and who popularizes this expression, neoliberalism, he blames so-called neoliberalism. Listen, blames child poverty, Hurricane Katrina, crisis 2008, global warming, and many other evils. So he probably senses that to some people, even on the left, it might not make sense. So he says, I quote, "These problems, which were listed, appear unrelated, but they all have something in common. They arise in large part from a meeting that took place 60 years ago in a Swiss spa resort." It's a reference to Montpellier. It laid the foundations for the philosophy of government that is responsible for many, perhaps most, of our contemporary crises. Unquote. So don't get me wrong, not all people who talk about neoliberalism, they talk like this. But half of them do. At the same time, the most sensible individuals on the left, they do feel that it's a very extreme version of what they want to present. So one of the leftist writers, he couldn't resist and actually debated this left Guardian writer. He said, "Why don't you include Zika virus among the things neoliberalism produced?" It's useless to argue with these people by providing rational arguments. And in fact, that's the point of my paper, and here's the gist of my paper, that many libertarians and conservatives, they try to passionately argue that this is wrong, neoliberalism is absurd, this thing doesn't exist, it's a pure myth, and it's actually correct. Okay, I agree with this. But what they don't understand, you cannot use rational arguments pointing out that neoliberalism is a flawed academic concept. Okay, they do have a point. But the problem with such approach, when you use rational arguments against neoliberalism, you use rational arguments against the concept that is fundamentally ideological. The refutation of neoliberalism does not explain the growing popularity of this expression among the left. It ignores this ideological and I would say eschatological nature of this concept. That is why instead of dismissing neoliberalism as a myth, I suggest to take it seriously for what it is. An ideologically loaded rhetoric, tainted with obvious conspiracy elements. In other words, I suggest that we unpack this expression and to see what it actually represents. Before I proceed, let me make a small detour to make a few important points. You will see why it's so important. We know that people usually embrace conspiracy theories in response to real or imagined fears of losing control. Conspiracy beliefs help bring groups together to oppose decline of their status and power. Recent research shows that because they have been on the losing side by the end of 2016, number of people on the left who cling to conspiracy theories increased from 27% to 32%. Whereas on the right, the number of conspiracy buffs dropped from 28% to 19%. And I took these numbers from a recent issue of New York Times for February 16th, so you can check it out. I want to argue that the conspiracy traits we find in the concept of neoliberalism actually reveal growing fears and concerns shared by the left and left liberal audiences, especially left-wing intellectuals, about their status and power. The escalating hysteria about the global advance of neoliberalism points to the left frustrations about losing economic debates and recently political power. For the past 30 years, for many of them, it was hard to accept the very idea that socialism in Eastern Europe was on decline, that in India it was on decline, that it partially became degenerated socialism in China. And it became hard for them to accept the idea of this declining welfare state. And neither were they ready to welcome the expansion from below the ideas of individual freedom. So, no wonder many of these folks who speak about so-called neoliberalism began interpreting what was going on the ground among the people as a shift in public opinions, shift in mass opinions. They started to interpret this as a global conspiracy, as a global project. Machinations of some right-wing intellectuals and financiers. And by the way, neoliberalism gained a special popularity in the 1990s. The time, it's not accident. That was the time when communist system was rapidly disintegrating in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, as you remember. So, what is important here to know that they don't use the word capitalism, because capitalism, in their views, was something naturally grown, and then something that exhausted its potential and became replaced by the welfare state. Okay, but neoliberalism viewed as a counter-revolution, as a revolt of right-wing forces that try to roll back the world. Okay, and that's what they call neoliberalism. David Harvey, a popular Marxist scholar whose book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, is widely read among the left, and it's considered actually a textbook which instructors use in their courses on world history, world politics, and so forth. So this guy, David Harvey, he actually says, neoliberalism, I quote, should not be identified with laissez-faire, but rather with permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention. And one more quotation from him. I have always treated neoliberalism as a political project carried out by corporate capitalist class. Okay. Essentially, the so-called neoliberalism exists as a bogeyman to oppose attempts to roll back governmental control. In the imagination of mainstream left after 1945, they had this ideal state, welfare state that replaced the so-called wild capitalism. And essentially they fetishized and romanticized the state that emerged in the 20th century, that was created by 2 world wars, by the marshal, militarized spirit of the 20th century. That's what they idealized. And we shouldn't forget that the statism, up above statism, became like, shaped the identity of the left. Okay, so that is why it's hard for them to the present day to part with this identity. Okay. The fact that we deal here with people, true believers, and it's impossible to argue with them, we see many facts that point in this direction. Okay. First, it's taken to the extreme, this activity Austrian and Chicago school, ascribing to them what actually was going on the ground, okay, by people themselves. Recently, and before I came here to do this presentation, in London Times, I found a curious story that indicates that we do deal with people who are true believers. Okay. The Times published a story about UK graduate student who filed a complaint with 3 departmental chairs, demanding to discipline his political science professor, who refused to use this expression of neoliberalism in his lectures, and who called the whole phenomenon a myth. So we do deal with these people who are true believers. That is why it's futile to furnish rational arguments that there is no such thing as a neoliberalism, and to point out that one cannot pile together Hayek, Hurricane Katrina, and a budget deficit. Since for thousands of the leftists, it does exist, this phenomenon they call neoliberalism. The whole industry flourished in geography, in humanities, in anthropology, in sociology. So we can call this industry neoliberalism studies. Okay. Since thousands of the leftist intellectuals, they do accept it, we have to treat it as an article of their faith and approach this as we approach religious apocalyptic prophecy. So, and I'm coming to my conclusions. In my view, so-called neoliberalism is an inversion of the left real existing paranoia about the loss of their identity and the fear about the future of their status. Those writers who generalize about the advance of dark forces of neoliberalism, they easily slip in conspiracy mode, simply because they ignore what is going on the ground. Or, to put it simply, they ignore what good old Marxists call the role of masses. Okay, so they don't pay any attention to so-called deplorables, as we call them. So they are fetishizing, romanticizing, idealizing the role of the elites. Okay, so without what is going on the ground, without tectonic shifts from below since 1980s, the Hayek-Friedman cabal, quote unquote, would remain marginal, as it in fact had been from 1930s to 1960s. If you read any Hayek biography, you will see, for example, how lonely and depressed Hayek was in the 1960s, being surrounded by Keynesians who at that time were writing the public opinion and who controlled at that time the commanding heights in the government, in the economy. But then the shift happened. Okay, fundamental shift. Don't get me wrong. Ideas are very important, very powerful, but I'm sure you will agree with me that it's absurd to ascribe the ascent of individual freedom and economic freedom exclusively to the intellectual activism of the Austrians or to the Chicago school. Okay. Words are very important, but they acquire their meaning spontaneously. They make sense to some people and don't make sense to others. As an ideologically loaded metaphor and a concept, neoliberalism is very potent and very powerful and very popular with the left, and they're going to use it increasingly. Okay, simply denouncing as a myth or trying to refute it with rational arguments is pointless. I also disagree with those scholars from different disciplines who try to argue that we can reclaim this definition. In fact, we can turn neoliberalism as a neutral definition for the description of the most recent stage of capitalism or something like this. Okay. Since neoliberalism studies actually represent an ideological tool for a moral indictment of economic liberty, and all attempts to roll back governmental control, we need to understand why neoliberalism concept emerged in the first place, and I hope I explained to you this.